Ridgefield, Connecticut. Christopher Walken's farmhouse, March 12, 2004. Friday morning, 10:47 a.m. The phone rings in the kitchen while Walken is reading the newspaper and drinking coffee. Outside, early spring rain patters against the windows of the 18th century colonial house he shares with his wife, Georgianne. At 61, he settled into a comfortable rhythm of selective work and quiet country living. The caller is director David Dobkin, pitching a role in a comedy called Wedding Crashers. The part is Cleary, the eccentric patriarch of a wealthy family whose daughter is getting married. It's a supporting role in what sounds like a typical romantic comedy starring Owen Wilson and Vince Vaughn. I want you to play the father, Dobkin says, but not a normal father. This guy is intimidating, unpredictable, maybe a little dangerous. The kind of dad who makes everyone uncomfortable at family gatherings. Christopher Walken listens with growing interest. After years of being typecast as generic villains in forgettable films, directors are finally starting to understand how to use his unique abilities. This sounds like an opportunity to bring his distinctive intensity to comedy without sacrificing what makes him compelling as a performer. 6 days later, Walken will show up on set and create Cleary, a character so memorably unnerving that he'll spawn thousands of imitations and remind audiences that the most effective comedy often comes from people who aren't trying to be funny. But first, he needs to understand what David Dobkin sees in him that other comedy directors have missed. The story begins 2 months earlier in a Los Angeles editing room where Dobkin is struggling with the script for Wedding Crashers. The film follows two friends who crash weddings to meet women, but get in over their heads when they encounter a family of wealthy wasps with serious dysfunction beneath their polished exterior. The role of Cleary is crucial to the film's success. He needs to be threatening enough to create real stakes for the protagonist, but not so obviously villainous that he destroys the comedy. He's supposed to be the kind of father who loves his family, but expresses that love in ways that make everyone deeply uncomfortable. I want someone who can make family dinner feel like a hostage situation, Dobkin tells the casting director. Someone who can ask about your job and make it sound like an interrogation. The casting director suggests several name actors known for comedy, but Dobkin has a different vision. He wants someone with genuine edge, someone whose mere presence changes the energy of a scene. That's when Christopher Walken's name comes up. He's never really done comedy, the casting director points out. Exactly, Dobkin replies. That's what will make it work. Dobkin has been studying Walken's work, particularly his ability to make ordinary dialogue sound vaguely threatening. In films like Pulp Fiction and Batman Returns, Walken creates menace not through obvious aggression, but through unpredictable line readings and unsettling pauses. Those same qualities could make domestic scenes hilarious if applied to family comedy. The director also recognizes something that many filmmakers miss about Christopher Walken. His comedy comes from complete commitment to character rather than obvious joke-telling. When Walken is funny, it's because he's playing someone who takes themselves absolutely seriously. The best comedy villains don't know they're villains, Dobkin explains to producer Peter Abram. They think they're being helpful or protective or reasonable. Christopher Walken understands characters like that, but convincing Walken to take the role requires more than just offering him the script. By 2004, he's become increasingly selective about projects, preferring to stay home in Connecticut rather than chase every opportunity. The farmhouse represents freedom from the pressures of Hollywood, space to think about what kinds of stories actually interest him. When Dobkin calls that Friday morning, Walken's first response is typically cautious. Comedy isn't really my specialty, he tells the director. That's exactly why you'd be perfect for this, Dobkin replies. Cleary isn't supposed to be obviously funny. He's supposed to be genuinely intimidating. Let the other actors and the situation create the humor. You just be real. This approach appeals to Christopher Walken's sensibilities. Throughout his career, he's been most effective when directors allow him to find truth in characters, rather than asking him to manufacture artificial emotions. If Dobkin wants him to play Cleary as genuinely threatening rather than comedically villainous, that's territory where Walken feels comfortable. Send me the script, he agrees. I'll read it. The Wedding Crashers screenplay arrives by messenger the next day, and Walken is immediately intrigued by how Cleary is written. The character appears in only 4 scenes, but each one reveals new layers of psychological complexity. He's protective of his family, but in ways that feel more like surveillance than love. He's successful in business, but treats personal relationships like strategic negotiations. Most intriguingly, Cleary seems to genuinely like the protagonist while simultaneously making it clear that he could destroy them without much effort. He's hospitable and threatening at the same time, which creates exactly the kind of tonal complexity that Walken specializes in. The hunting scene particularly catches his attention. Cleary takes the Wedding Crashers skeet shooting ostensibly as a friendly bonding activity, but the subtext suggests he's demonstrating what happens to people who threaten his family. It's the kind of scene that could be played for pure comedy or genuine menace, but works best when it contains both elements simultaneously. This character has layers players, Walken tells Georgianne after finishing the script. He's not just a one-dimensional obstacle for the heroes. He's got his own psychology, his own way of seeing the world. That psychological complexity is what ultimately convinces Christopher Walken to take the role. Cleary represents an opportunity to explore how intimidating people function in normal social situations, how they maintain the illusion of civility while making their power unmistakably clear. He calls Dobkin back on Tuesday morning. "I'm interested," he says, "but I want to talk about how to play this guy. He can't be obviously crazy or obviously evil. He has to believe he's being reasonable." The conversation that follows becomes a masterclass in character development. Dobkin and Walken spend an hour discussing Cleary's background, his relationship with his family, his business philosophy, his understanding of appropriate social behavior. They decide that Cleary genuinely loves his daughters, but expresses that love through control and intimidation. He's successful in business because he can read people's weaknesses and exploit them, but he applies those same skills to family relationships without understanding why that makes people uncomfortable. He thinks he's being protective, Walken explains. In his mind, making people slightly afraid of him is how you keep them safe. This psychological framework gives Walken everything he needs to inhabit the character. Cleary isn't evil. He's someone whose good intentions manifest in deeply unsettling ways. He's the kind of father who genuinely wants his children to be happy, but defines happiness in terms of control and submission. Filming begins 6 days after Dobkin's initial phone call at a mansion in Maryland that serves as the Cleary family estate. The first scene involves Cleary meeting Owen Wilson and Vince Vaughn's characters at a family dinner, and Walken's approach immediately establishes the tone for his entire performance. Instead of playing Cleary as obviously threatening, he makes him intensely interested in his guest. He asks personal questions with the focused attention of someone conducting a psychological evaluation. He listens to their answers with the kind of concentration that suggests he's filing away information for future use. "So you're in the mutual fund business," he says to Wilson's character, and somehow makes it sound like an accusation. The other actors are initially unsure how to respond to Walken's approach. They've prepared for a more straightforward comedic antagonist, but Cleary feels genuinely unpredictable. They have to stay alert and reactive, never quite sure if he's being friendly or threatening. "Working with Christopher was like being in a scene with a live wire," Owen Wilson later recalls. "You never knew which direction he was going to take things, but you knew it was going to be interesting." Vince Vaughn has a similar experience. He would do things that weren't in the script, little gestures or line readings that completely changed the energy of the scene, but they always felt right for the character. The hunting scene becomes the film's most memorable sequence, largely because of Walken's ability to make Cleary's intentions ambiguous. When he hands Wilson a shotgun and starts talking about protecting his family, it's simultaneously a bonding moment and a veiled threat. "I hunt," Cleary says simply, and Walken's delivery contains multitudes. He's talking about skeet shooting, but the subtext suggests he's willing to hunt anything that threatens his loved one. The scene works because Walken never winks at the camera or signals that Cleary is supposed to be funny. He plays the character with complete sincerity, allowing the situation and the other actors' reactions to create the humor. Director David Dobkin recognizes that he's witnessing something special. Christopher took what could have been a typical comedy villain and made him into someone genuinely complex, he later explains. "Cleary is scary because he's real. We've all met fathers like that." The psychological realism extends to Cleary's relationship with his daughters. When he interacts with them, Walken shows a man who genuinely loves his children, but has no idea how to express that love in healthy ways. He's protective to the point of suffocation, loving to the point of control. "You see his heart," Dobkin observes, "but you also see why his family is so messed up." The performance influences every other actor in the film. Rachel McAdams, playing Cleary's daughter, has to navigate scenes with a father figure who feels authentically intimidating. Her character's romantic choices suddenly make more sense when viewed as rebellion against this kind of overwhelming paternal control. Even the comic relief scenes gain depth from Walken's commitment to psychological truth. When Cleary appears unexpectedly or asks probing questions, the other character's discomfort feels genuine rather than manufactured for laughs. Wedding Crashers becomes a massive hit when it's released in July 2005, earning over $280 million worldwide. Critics praise the film's blend of raunchy comedy and genuine emotion, but many single out Christopher Walken's performance as particularly memorable. "Walken creates a character who's funny precisely because he's not trying to be funny," writes one reviewer. "Cleary is terrifying in the most suburban way possible." The role introduces Christopher Walken to a new generation of comedy fans who may not be familiar with his dramatic work, but immediately recognize his ability to make any scene more interesting simply by being present. More importantly for his career, Wedding Crashers proves that Walken can be a valuable asset in comedies without sacrificing the psychological complexity that makes him unique as a performer. He doesn't have to choose between being taken seriously and being entertaining. The success leads to similar opportunities in films like Hairspray and Click, roles that utilize his ability to find truth in potentially cartoonish characters. Directors begin to understand that Christopher Walken's comedy works best when he's playing real people in surreal situations, rather than obviously comedic characters. Years later, Cleary becomes a template for how to write intimidating father figures in family comedy. The character spawns countless imitations and parodies, but none capture what made Walken's performance so effective: his complete commitment to finding the psychology behind the intimidation. I never played Cleary as a villain. Walken reflects in interviews about the role. I played him as a father who loves his family but doesn't understand boundaries. That's much scarier than someone who's obviously evil. The observation reveals something important about Christopher Walken's approach to any character, comedic or dramatic. He looks for the human truth beneath the surface, the psychological logic that makes behavior seem reasonable to the person exhibiting it. 6 days after David Dobkin called asking him to play the father, Christopher Walken had created Cleary, a character who proves that the most effective comedy often comes from the most serious performances. The role also represents something larger about Walken's late career renaissance. Instead of being limited to obvious villain parts, he's found a way to bring his unique intensity to any genre, making every project more interesting through pure commitment to character truth. That's what happened when Christopher Walken made everyone terrified of family dinners. He didn't play a comedy villain. He played a real father whose love feels like a threat, and somehow that became hilarious. The impact of Walken's performance extends far beyond the film's commercial success. Wedding Crashers spawns a new subgenre of comedy fathers who express love through intimidation, but none of the imitators understand what made Cleary so effective. The difference lies in Christopher Walken's commitment to finding psychological truth within seemingly exaggerated behavior. He doesn't play Cleary as a caricature of an overprotective father. He plays him as someone whose genuine concern for his family manifests in deeply unsettling ways. The hunting scene becomes a template for how to create tension within family comedy. Film students analyze Walken's performance to understand how he makes Cleary's intentions ambiguous enough to be simultaneously threatening and protective. The brilliance of Christopher's performance is that you're never quite sure if Cleary is planning to bond with the guys or bury them in the backyard. Owen Wilson reflects years later. That uncertainty is what makes every scene electric. The psychological complexity extends to Cleary's relationship with his wife, played by Jane Seymour. Walken suggests through subtle interactions that their marriage operates on the same principles of control and submission that define his relationship with his daughter. Behind the scenes, Christopher Walken's preparation involves extensive research into family psychology and the sociology of wealthy American families. He studies how generational wealth affects parent-child relationship, how privilege can become its own form of imprisonment. Cleary genuinely loves his family, Walken explains in interviews, but his definition of love involves complete control over their environment and choices. He thinks he's protecting them from the world, but he's actually protecting them from life itself. The effectiveness of this approach becomes clear during test screening. Audiences laugh not because Cleary's behavior is obviously comedic, but because Walken's intense commitment to the character makes ordinary family situations feel genuinely surreal. Christopher created a character who's scary precisely because he exists in every family. Rachel McAdams observes, "We all know fathers like Cleary, men who love their children, but express that love in ways that feel suffocating." The film's success leads to discussions about the evolution of father figures in American comedy. Critics note that Cleary represents a new kind of patriarch, someone whose authority comes not from obvious aggression, but from psychological manipulation disguised as concern. The hunting scene, in particular, becomes a masterclass in subtext. Walken and the writers create a sequence where every line of dialogue operates on multiple levels simultaneously. "I hunt," Cleary says simply, but the context makes it clear he's not just talking about skeet shooting. The statement becomes a philosophy of life, a warning, and a promise, all at once. Young actors begin studying the scene to understand how experienced performers can layer meaning into seemingly straightforward dialogue. Walken's ability to suggest vast depths beneath simple statements becomes a template for sophisticated character work. The success also demonstrates the value of casting against type in carefully calculated ways. Christopher Walken's reputation for intensity makes Cleary more effective than a traditionally comedic actor might have been. 20 years later, Cleary remains one of Christopher Walken's most quoted characters, with lines like "I hunt" and "crab cakes and football" entering popular culture alongside his more famous dramatic dialogue. 6 days after David Dobkin called asking him to play the father, Christopher Walken had created Cleary, a character who proves that the most effective comedy often comes from the most serious performances, and that families can be genuinely terrifying even when they're trying to be welcoming.